Okay, last Sunday we started on lesson 18, Jesus and the Sabbath. The second, and I didn't make this announcement then, but the how to study the Bible portion, uh, I discussed it with Wayne and others, and because we did this not too long ago when Wayne taught a class and how we got the Bible, a lot of this was already covered. So, for the sake of time, because this is kind of a long unit, we're not going to go over that particular section. We'll finish up here on how Jesus healed the crippled man on the Sabbath, and then the other two Sabbath examples given to us, as we'll discuss. So, anyway, last week we got through uh, to verse 30 of chapter 5 in John. That will be our primary text that we'll be operating out of. We talked about Christ healing the paralytic man. Uh, Man had been lame for 38 years. He was by the pool at Bethesda on one of the five porches. In his mind, the water had curing powers to it. And Jesus saw him, knew what was in his heart, asked him, "Do you want to be made well?" And we talked about that might have kind of been like a funny question to ask, but in truth, it was a good question because the man had some sin in his life, as you find there in verse 14. When Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you have been made well, sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you." Jesus was telling the others that he has equality with God in nature, with God in power, and with God in authority. And we went over that. One of the things that he said, that he was united with God in giving life, raising the dead, and judgment. And the response should have been joyous. But we know from verse 23, as Wayne pointed out, they all should have honored the Son just as they honored the Father, but they didn't. He who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who had sent him. So we concluded with that part there. We see in this first part that we've talked about that Jesus had made some pretty incredible claims of power, authority, and relationships. He would be forced to either offer some proof that what he was saying was true, or he have to retract his statements. And so then, now we're going to look in verses 31 through 47 about the impeccable credentials that John writes about. Jesus recognized that he and his claims, they were on trial. He called a progression of witnesses to testify on his behalf, so to speak, that would make the most seasoned lawyers cringe. I like that. Look at verse 31 of chapter 5 of John. My Bible reads, "If I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true." Probably if you have the ESV or the New American Standard, it says, "If I alone bear witness of myself." Now, question, does this mean that Jesus would misrepresent himself or lie? No, not at all. We know that. We know that for sure. See, Jesus' statement that his testimony alone is not true must be understood in the light of the teaching of the law, which required, remember how many witnesses? Two or three to be witnesses. We find that in Numbers 35 and Deuteronomy 17. So, when Jesus said his statement alone was not true, it did not mean it was false. He was making concessions to the Jewish legal system. Does that make sense? Yeah. In verse 32, Jesus spoke of an independent witness. He says, "There is another who testifies of me." Now, Jesus did not identify this another here, but it's plain that he was speaking of the Father and not John the Baptist. Since he had no need to receive testimony from man, he points that out in verse 34. Jesus' awareness of his mission and his relationship to the Father was not simply based on his own convictions. Because of the Father's testimony, Jesus knew he was not speaking of his own will, but made this as clear as he possibly could when he wrote in John 12:49 and 50. He says, "For I did not speak on my own initiative, but the Father himself who sent me has given me a commandment as to what to say and what to speak. I know that his commandment is eternal life. Therefore, the things I speak just as the Father has told me." See, Jesus was not citing the Father's testimony for the sake of the opposition here, but rather to reinforce his own claims about himself. Only the witness of the Father was sufficient to assure Jesus that his testimony was true. Any thoughts or questions about that particular portion? Okay. Now let's look at the testimony of John the Baptist. The Jews needed additional witnesses, and Jesus met the challenge by turning to the witness of John the Baptist. Notice in verse 33, "You have sent to John, and he has borne witness to the truth." "You have sent to John" probably refers to the delegation sent by the religious leaders and authorities in Jerusalem to inquire about the nature of John's ministry. Remember back in chapter 1, verse 19. They wanted to know what was going on here. And remember what John the Baptist said. He said he identified Jesus as the true light, the Lamb of God, and the Son of God. We find that in all of chapter 1, verses 9, 29, and 34. See, Jesus did not intend John the Baptist's testimony to substantiate his claim. He was who he was. Okay? But of course, Jesus was speaking for the benefit of the listeners, the people that were there. They should have known. They had the answers already, didn't they? Now, next on the list of witnesses is the works of Jesus. Look at verse 36, please. Jesus says, "But I have a greater witness than John's for the works which the Father has given me to finish. The very works that I do bear witness of me that the Father has sent me." Jesus had performed many miracles on previous trips to Jerusalem. We read that in John 2 and 23. Concerning these miracles, you may remember Nicodemus, we studied him a while back, had said, "We know that you come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him." John 3 and 2. Jesus had also done at least one miracle on the present trip to Jerusalem, the healing of the lame man at the pool that we talked about last Sunday. And who may have been there, or who may have been close by when all this was going on. Jesus' critics could not deny that he did miracles, but still they refused to accept him as the Messiah. Question: wouldn't you think seeing the miracles performed by Jesus would be common sense to anybody that this is who he is? I mean, I can't fathom them not, except for that hatred that brews in them, I guess. Exactly. Hard heart. And he goes on to talks about this later on in here too. It just, to me, is amazing. But nevertheless, look at in verses 37 and 38. Witness of the Father. "And the Father himself who sent me has testified of me. You have neither heard his voice at any time nor seen his form. But you do not have his word abiding in you, because whom he sent, him you do not believe. You have the witness of the Father." Now, it's unlikely that Jesus was equating the Father's witness with the Scriptures, since we're going to talk about that in a few moments in verse 39. It's probably more likely that Jesus was alluding to the voice that came from heaven 3 times during his ministry. One, remember, after his baptism. 2, at the Transfiguration, and 3, following the triumphal entry in John 12 and 28. John 12 and 28. Now, remember back in chapter 132, no voice was mentioned. The other 3 Gospels, Luke, Matthew, and Mark, do say that this is my son who I am well pleased. But remember how John described it. There's no voice, just the Spirit descending like a dove. Okay? Now, although the witnesses should have been clear here, Jesus did not anticipate, again, he knew the hearts, that the Jews would acknowledge it, much yet respond favorably to it. See, they were ignorant for 3 reasons. 1, they never heard God's voice. Moses had heard it in Exodus 33 and 11, but the Jewish leaders were not true followers of Moses. Number 2, they had never seen God's form. Jacob, later Israel, had seen that form in Genesis 32, 30 and 31. But again, had these Jews been the Israelites, true Israelites, they would have seen God in Jesus. And number 3, they did not have God's word abiding in them. It says that in verse 38. You see, those who believe have the word abiding in them and believe in Jesus. Any questions so far? I'm not asking a lot of questions regarding it. It's pretty much, I think, kind of self-explanatory, but we need to go over it. Okay, let's talk next about the witness of the Scriptures. And that's in verse 39 through 47. As a final witness concerning his claims, Jesus called on the Scriptures. Since the Scriptures are from God, they constitute another aspect of the Father's witness. The Jews had a great love and respect for the Scriptures, indeed. Jesus said of them, look at verse 39, "You search the Scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life, and these are they which testify of me." Hundreds of passages in the Old Testament pointed forward to Christ. Whole chapters dedicated. Psalms 2, Psalms 22, Isaiah 53, complete chapters. Jesus later spoke of all the things which are written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms. He said that in Luke 24 and 44. But yet they didn't listen. But it's interesting that in their own way, the Jewish leaders were devoted to the Scriptures. Now you may say, what? Rabbi writing said, "He who has gained for himself words of the law has gained for himself life in the world to come." Interesting. For this reason, they pored over the Scriptures. But still, they missed the purpose of the Scriptures, which, according to the Apostle Paul, were designed to bring people to Christ, Galatians 3 and 24. They missed it. Think about it for a moment. Moses had written of the seed that would come, Genesis 3 and 15, 22 and 18, Galatians 3:16, that the promised one would come from the tribe of Judah, right? Genesis 49. He who had spoken of a prophet who would arise like him, Deuteronomy 18. And Jesus said that not only did Moses witness for himself, but in the end, he would stand as a witness for those who reject Jesus. Look at verse 45. Jesus said, "Do not think that I shall accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, in whom you trust." Moses is going to be there to accuse him. Now, let me ask this question now. With this massive evidence at their disposal, why did the Jewish leaders reject Jesus? Kind of what I think you said a little earlier on. Hard of heart. They don't want change. I mean, when we get into these next 2 healings and things that took place, not healing, one healing and one in the vineyard and the grain field, it's amazing how low they stooped, in my opinion. Okay? Jesus said that the problem was one of the will and heart. Verses 40 through 42, read with me. But you are not willing to come to me that you may have life. Willing. I do not receive honor from men, but I know you that you do not have the love of God in you. It was mentioned by, I forget who it was, in fact, that they were seeking glory from men instead of the glory that is from the one and only God. Verse 44 says that. How can you believe who receive honor from one another and do not seek the honor that comes from the only God? See, the condition of the religious authorities in Jerusalem could be summarized by saying that they knew so much that was not true about things that did not matter. They were deaf, dumb, and blind to the truth. And that's putting it bluntly. They were. Isn't it sobering to realize that it is possible, in this case, to be a diligent student of the Word without ever coming to a saving knowledge of the truth? Pharisees are a good example of that. Good example. May God help us always to approach the Scriptures with the right attitude, a love of the truth, and with the right aim to know God. In the concluding of this portion of the lesson, the Jewish leaders probably expected Jesus to be intimidated when they accused him of breaking the Sabbath, but he was not. Instead, he met their challenge and made a radical claim. Since the Jews were unable to refute his arguments, they should have accepted him as the Son of God, but sadly they remained unwilling to do so. Any comments or questions? Yes, sir.
The nail in the coffin, so to speak, was that they didn't see in Jesus what they expected in the fulfillment of
What they thought.
Messiah.
Yeah.
That he was to be of the royal lineage of David and reestablish the kingdom and throw off the yoke of the Romans. And Jesus didn't fulfill any of those preconceived ideas.
No.
And that wasn't. So that's the nail. I mean, all the other things you talked about are true.
Right.
But they weren't willing to investigate him further because he didn't just, his appearance.
He didn't fit their mold.
He didn't fit.
Yeah.
So they rejected anything. They discounted his miracles. All of the arguments he makes that are witnesses for him, they've already ignored them.
Not the one we thought.
The descendant of David.
That's exactly right. They were already predetermined in the mind because, like you said, they did not fit the mold that they thought was going to come.
Someone to establish an earthly kingdom. Good comment. Thank you. Wayne.
The number one reason they rejected Jesus was if they admitted to or had accepted everything that Jesus claimed to be, and claimed that he could do and would do, etc. For them, that was, that's putting the nail in the coffin in terms of their authority.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they accept that he is the authority from God, then that completely destroys their position in life and in their religious realm. So it was the affront to their authority that they were the most prejudiced by, because he would completely displace them in the position among the people.
Every time they thought that they had him cornered, he turned it right back on. And this just, of course, made him more mad, infuriated. Other comments? Yes.
Daniel.
Want to throw in there. I think there may be more than one reason, but when you think of the character of God, that's not going to change. Just in the New Testament, God's going to stay the same forever, right?
Right.
And you see them constantly butting heads with Jesus, and Jesus is pretty much showing the world in human form the character of God. But you go back, even in the Old Testament, and the Lord there in the wilderness, they were constantly butting heads with him, and he was trying to show them his character then. So I think what it comes down to is a lot of people just will not love God for who he is. And I think we see that nowadays. We try to show God's character to people, but they just won't love him because they don't want to change their heart.
And they enjoy sin too much.
Yes, sir.
Bring that time current, if you could. If it wasn't on TV or endorsed by a celebrity, the same thing. If you go back in time, you look at the structure of the Pharisees had and Nicodemus, there's so much that we don't know what really happened to Nicodemus. He believed, but was he not willing to give up his power and riches? It's pretty hard, to say, I really like driving my brand new Lexus, but it's okay. I'm going to go drive this 1958 Volkswagen and beat up Beetle. And that's what you have to give up everything for the truth. You just bring things current. What would we do? I mean, honestly, what would we be if Christ was here?
I would hope that any of us would do whatever it took to get rid of anything that stood in the way. We talked about this last Sunday between us and God.
If something hindered us, would we be willing to give it up to help ensure our, salvation and eternal life? Sure hope so. Yes, sir.
We see in Nicodemus, his journey of faith, it's going to take him long.
Yes.
It's going to cost him more. He knows that. But I think that he cancels his ticket with the Sanhedrin. He prepares Jesus' life there. Along with Joseph of Arimathea, he's a disciple but one secretly, but not until he gives up a new tomb.
Yeah.
I think that they're done as respected rabbis. And I would like to think that that's
The turning point.
that's the turning
Yeah.
point.
I feel like you're right on
Other comments? Okay, let's talk about another story about Jesus defending his disciples. We're going to read Mark 2, but we're also refer to Matthew and Luke at times. I'll get there. Mark 2, beginning in verse 23. Mark writes, "Now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. As they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of the grain. And the Pharisees said to him, 'Look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?' But he said to them, 'Have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him? How he went to the house of God in the days of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat, except for the priest, and also gave some to those who were with him. And he said to them,'" and we've gone over this in class before, "'the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath.'" After Christ returned to Galilee, on one Sabbath, he and his disciples were walking through a grain field. And these disciples became hungry, and they began to pick the heads of the grain and eat. Now Luke, in his rendition, adds that the disciples were rubbing the heads of grain in their hands. That's in Luke 6:1. It's interesting, coming from Kansas, wheat farmer, my family, relatives were and are. You know, we got combines today that harvest that. What a great invention that was. It still is. And as that wheat is cut, of course, it goes into the machine, and each kernel of wheat has a husk around it. And so they has to be battered and agitated and broken up to release that grain, which falls through, then is augured up into the grain bin to be loaded onto trucks later on. And what's left is the chaff. And that goes out the back end. There's a fan that kind of blows around, spreading it around. Some people take the belt off and just let it come out in a windrow so they can bale it for straw hay later. And so, but it's interesting that you have to agitate that a little bit. And that's what Jesus' disciples were doing. And they were perceived to be harvesting according to the Pharisees and their traditions. You know, Roper makes an interesting comment. I don't know if you saw it, and to me this is humorous. He says, imagine the pompous Pharisees in their ornate robes, crouching down, hiding in a grain field, waiting to pounce on Jesus for the slightest infraction of their ridiculous traditions. I couldn't have said it better myself. I mean, that to me is just ludicrous. See, the accusation was not that they were stealing another man's grain. Well, now, wait a minute. Did they have permission to take this grain? Huh? It was allowed. Yeah, I didn't know this. Over in Deuteronomy 23, let's turn there because this is kind of neat. Deuteronomy 23 and verses 24 and 25 says this. When you come into your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat your fill of grapes at your pleasure, but you shall not put any in your container. In verse 25, when you come into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the heads with your hand, but you shall not use a sickle on your neighbor's standing grain. So yes, it was allowed. You know, now I wouldn't recommend anybody driving along the road and see a vineyard of nice grapes ripe and ready to pick, getting out and picking some. Although that would be an interesting case in court, wouldn't it? Judge, God told me it's okay to do that. You know, now our founding fathers were pretty religious, so I don't know. But I thought that was kind of interesting. But you see, as far as the Pharisees were concerned, this is ridiculous. Picking a few heads of grain was equivalent to harvesting. Rubbing the grain together was like threshing. Blowing away the husk was winnowing. And eating the heads of the grain was like grinding. How ridiculous. In fact, someone said the Pharisees would probably add that the disciples had prepared a meal, which was forbidden on the Sabbath. Who knows what they would have done. But Jesus' defense on this occasion was different than presented in Jerusalem. At the close, he said, the Pharisees were condemning the innocent. We find that in Matthew 12:7 in his rendition. In other words, Jesus pleaded not guilty, and he did so on 5 grounds. He's not guilty because David was not judged guilty when he ate the sacred bread in the tabernacle to appease his hunger. Look there in verse 25 of Luke 2. Have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry? He and those who were with him, how he went to the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat, except for the priest, and also gave some to those who were with him. Every Friday before Sabbath, they had to bake 12 new loaves of showbread. And the priests were allowed to eat the old ones. But David was hungry. They didn't condemn him. That was one. Number 2, not guilty because the priests were not judged guilty when they worked on the Sabbath. Don't you imagine the priests were pretty busy on the Sabbath? Yeah, doing all those temple duties. Busiest day of the week for them. Number 3, they're not guilty because the Sabbath was intended to be a blessing, not a burden. Mark tells us that in verse 27 of chapter 2. To deny the disciples simple sustenance on the Sabbath placed unreasonable burden on them. Number 4, not guilty because relieving suffering, including hunger, was more important than fulfilling rituals, especially man-made rituals. See, Jesus reminded the accusers of the teaching of Hosea 6:6, I desire compassion and not sacrifice. Not guilty, the 5th one, because the Messiah could not be subjected to man's traditions. Jesus made 2 statements that must have just made the Pharisees livid. 1, but I say to you that something or someone, depending on your translation, greater than the temple is here. That's in Matthew 12:6. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Matthew 12:8. See, Jesus was obviously referring to himself. He, not they, had the authority to decide what would or who could deal with the framework of the Old Testament laws concerning the Sabbath. None of these examples, now this is important, none of these examples should be taken as proof that we can break God's laws. But Jesus' point was that if the Jewish leaders did not condemn David or the priest, why did they condemn him and his followers? Put it right back on them. How can you blame or claim that we're doing wrong when you didn't do it towards the other folks? They had a good point. They had a good point. Of course, this angered them all the more, right? Questions or comments about? Yes.
That what Jesus really does here is their traditions were really extensions or application of what they thought the law meant. They weren't law.
Right.
Where Jesus said it was specifically, the showbread was specifically intended for the priests alone, only. Nobody else was to do it. They did not condemn David, but he did that. Doesn't mean David was wrong. He did what was wrong. But they condemned him for it. But they will condemn Jesus for something that they only have surmised might bring guilt on him. Right? So they've taken the law is really not very specific about you will do no work on the Sabbath.
Right.
And so,
but we're going to see as we get into the Jesus healing the man with the withered hand, is it okay to do good on the Sabbath? I mean, and I'll ask this ahead of time. Is evil being done on the Sabbath?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. All right. Any other comments on the eating of the grain? Okay, we're doing pretty good here. Jesus healed a withered hand on the Sabbath. We'll use Mark 3, 1 through 6 as our main text. We'll also look at Matthew 12 and Luke 6. It's interesting, shortly after, on another Sabbath, we don't know if it was one right after, but Jesus went into a synagogue where he was allowed to teach. Luke 6:6 tells us that. Now, according to Matthew's account, where he was allowed to teach was the synagogue of those Pharisees that just confronted him. It was their synagogue, Matthew 12 and 9, where they had tried to indict him in the grain field. Present in the assembly was a man whose hand was withered. Now, I wouldn't put it past the Pharisees to bring this man in as an entrapment for Jesus. They very well could have. It doesn't say, but they could have brought him in to try to trap him. The Pharisees watched for a while to see if Jesus would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him, of course. They desired to accuse him before the Jewish council that could impose the death penalty. The death penalty. And this is interesting. Finally, they could stand it no longer, and they interrupted Jesus' sermon, blurting out, question, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Jesus was not intimidated, though. He told the man with the withered hand, he says, get up and come forward. And with the man standing before the assembly, Christ asks his questioners, puts it right back on him. Puts it right back. Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? To save a life or to destroy it? You see, their own regulations allowed for physicians and others to save lives on the Sabbath, on the seventh day. Jesus then used this simple illustration, which all could relate to. He threw it right back on them. He said this too. He said, "What man is there among you who has a sheep, and if the sheep falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will he not take hold of it and lift him out?" Pretty common question. How much more valuable then is a man than a sheep? So then, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? They tried every way to trick Jesus, and he always came back to them and put them in their place. And respectful, kind. But see, when they didn't answer, when they couldn't answer that question or didn't want to answer it maybe, heartbroken at his enemy's lack of compassion, Jesus told the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out and it was restored to normal like the other. It was a miracle that all could see. Wayne.
Sure, it went right over their heads. But the questions that Jesus asked them, in a subtle way, maybe not so subtle, was telling them, look how ridiculous you have become in applying God's laws.
Remember, what was it? I forget the number. 300 and some odd ridiculous additions to the rules.
Just outrageous. Outrageous. And of course, when they did this and they saw it, his enemies had been silenced again. But they were not prepared to admit defeat. They never were. They went out and conspired against him as to how they might destroy him. Mark adds this, and this is mind-blowing in my opinion. Mark adds this unbelievable detail. The Pharisees went out and immediately began conspiring with the Herodians against him. Now, what was the relationship between the Pharisees and the Herodians? They hated one another. They despised one another because they supported pagan Gentile innovations of Herod the Great. But they evidently believed that they needed their political influence to silence Jesus. They hated the Herodians, but they hated Jesus more. What a sad, sad commentary. Yes, Wayne.
To the law that only the Roman rulers could handle capital offenses. They wanted to destroy Jesus. They wanted him dead.
Yeah.
And so by confiding or conspiring with the Herodians, it was their attempt to get the government on their side, so that when push came to shove, that they were sure that the Roman rulers would side with them in terms of what to do with Jesus.
Yeah. Very true.
Yes, sir.
Detail that Mark includes, Matthew and Luke don't. It's in verse 3, it says, after he had cast them, is it lawful on Sabbath to do good? But they were silent. Verse 3 says, and he looked around at them.
Yes.
And that is a detail that this, in a sense, Jesus, that they were so hard-hearted that they wouldn't recognize the common sense of what he was saying. You'll save a sheep in a pit,
But you won't say
you won't
for help. Yeah. That's a good point. I remember seeing that, and I wanted to bring that out. I just didn't write a note. Yeah.
He was angry. Kind of like when he cleansed the temple, throughout the money changers. Good point. As we close, one thing to all take from this is that all this Sabbath controversy, notice that Jesus never broke God's Sabbath laws, did he? Now, he did encourage, and he never encouraged anybody else. But occasionally, however, he did violate the man-made traditions that had blown up, prolificated through the years and had enraged his enemies. We're about halfway through the point in Jesus' public ministry, and already the adversaries were working night and day to destroy him. Any closing comments? And then we'll get to the questions. Daniel.
bring this forward. When you look at sometimes how people, Christians, can be today, being so concerned with do's and don'ts and following this and that sometimes you can forget that, you need to have a heart for those. Maybe those sins are not the sins that you commit, and maybe these sins that, that you're not tempted by. But I just think it's really important. I mean, Jesus was focused on their hearts, and I think we really need to keep that in mind, even just dealing with other people. That we really just got to use our hearts.
Yeah.
Jason.
This is somewhat speculative, but it's really not until Jesus starts to reveal himself more and more and call himself the Son of God to basically equate himself. And you're going to see that just a little bit later in John 5, but that they become even more insensitive to, hey, there's more than one God. You're equal with God. Who are you? The woman at the well in John 4, she thinks he's a prophet, someone amazing. Perhaps if that was the take on Jesus, and he didn't go in and confront the hypocrisy of these Pharisees and the Sadducees and the chief priests and stuff like that, then perhaps Jesus lived longer than 33. Again, that's speculation. But it isn't until he really starts to reveal who he is. And when we say that people don't believe, the first thing that always pops in my mind is Acts 4. You have Peter and John before that council. And Luke reports for us that these own men, these high men, these priestly men, and all of them, the scribes, that they don't deny that something amazing and wonderful has been done. Something supernatural to heal this individual. And yet they are so stuck on who the right Messiah is, their understanding of Messiah. They've already made up their mind about Jesus and his followers that, they want to just silence him. The Jewish world during this time is being turned upside down more than any time perhaps in history with Jesus and his apostles. And again, their hearts are just so hard and stuff. So it's pretty amazing.
Good point.
Let me just real quickly, I got about a minute to go over these questions, and that way I'll pass the burden on to anybody else. Describe the hostility of Jewish leaders towards Jesus. We talked about they wanted to destroy him. Meaning of the word Sabbath, rest. Okay. How did the observance of the Sabbath turn into a complicated, burdensome chore by all these add-on restrictions that they put on? What was Jesus' example of how he and his Father were united? We talked about it, giving life, raising the dead, and judging mankind, those three. Were the priests judged guilty when they worked on the Sabbath? No. How did the Pharisees view the Herodians? Hated, despised them. We've already said that Jesus never broke God's Sabbath laws. And did Jesus ever violate any of the man-made traditions? Yeah, when needed to. And then on the individual study guide, I'm just going to do the ones that are different. Number 1, Jesus' personal ministry is frequently stated to have lasted 3.5 years. Drop down to number 5, violation of Sabbath laws incurred what type of penalty? Death. Name the 3 major the Jewish feasts held in what? What were the 3 Jewish feasts we talked about? Passover, Pentecost, and Feast of the Tabernacle. Okay. What city did it take place in? Jerusalem. Law of Moses required testimony of how many witnesses? 2 or 3. What was the single purpose of the John the Baptizer? To foretold of the Jesus coming. What is the difference between knowing God's word and knowing the God of the word? I wrote down here, understanding God's nature. Could be some other things too. Good. What was the priest judge? Were the priest judged guilty when they worked on the Sabbath? No. What did God intend the Sabbath to be for the Jews? A blessing, not a burden. And those last 3 are the same as before. I did it. Didn't think I tell you, going over this lesson in the first part of it, I thought this is a 3 lesson study. But thank you very much for your opinions and the comments.